Oh, hello. My name is Tirzah Legg. I'm the Gallery Director for Firelands Association for the Visual Arts, better known as FAVA. Today we'll be meeting with the artists from More Than a Laughing Matter and our curator, Reid Wood. More Than a Laughing Matter is currently our online exhibition, which opened October 3rd and will close November 22nd. You can view it online at exhibitions.favagallery.org, which you can find the link for in the chat. You can also find my email address if you have any questions or if you're interested in purchasing any of the works that are listed in the exhibition for sale. Just send me an email and we can address that for you. So Reid will be our moderator for today. Reid Wood is a visual artist and a former professor living and working in Oberlin, Ohio. His background is in printmaking, and he'll be introducing our guests. Each artist will give you a brief introduction to themselves, and then we'll move on to a series of questions for open discussion between the panel members. Once the discussion has come to an end, we'll open up for Q&A portion where you can either directly address the artist or you can just type your question into the chat and we'll bring it up for you, excuse me, for you. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Reid. So here we go, Reid Wood.
Thank you, Tirzah, and welcome everybody. I'm glad you're joining us. This will be recorded as well, so that if you have friends who can't make it right now while it's happening live, they will be able to see it on FAVA's YouTube video channel. So you can let them know that if they wanted to see the discussion later on. I'll be getting to our panelists in just a minute. I want to point out, unfortunately, I'm sorry that Chris Colbert is not able to join us today, but the other four artists will be. And to quote the Grateful Dead, what a long, strange trip this has been. It was about 3 years ago that we first started talking about this exhibition and began planning it. We had various artists we contacted, several groups that were with us, and then some people had to drop out and so on. But we finally got our, I think, a good cross-section of artists here with the 5 that are exhibiting. And then COVID hit. And so we had to wait for a while to figure out what we were going to do. We couldn't bring people into the gallery initially. In fact, it's still not open for actual visitations, but we do have virtual shows. And as Tirzah said, this is a virtual exhibition as well. So I hope that you will, if you haven't seen it already, you definitely should take a look at it. And one of the things that's great about that is that you can take as much time as you want to view all of the various pieces, spend your time on them, come back to it later and so on. So with that, let's get to our 4 artists who are with us today. And each of them will be giving a sort of brief bio and overview of themselves and their work and so on. So I guess we'll start maybe alphabetically. Bentley, you wanna start out with who you are and what's up with you?
Sure. Thank you very much, Reid, and thanks to everyone for participating today. I am a Buckeye. I was born to the campus of Kenyon College because my dad was an art professor there. I was born in 1967, so I'm Gen X. And like most cartoonists of my generation, I wanted to be Charles Schulz. And then after that, I wanted to draw Batman. And I really feel fortunate that I grew up in a time when I could be bored. I think it's hard to be bored now, but for cartoonists of my generation, and for me, because we moved around, my dad never got tenure. So I actually spent 10 of my 18 years growing up in South Dakota, where there was only one professional cartoonist in the whole state. And I had to track that guy down to get career advice. But I did, because this is what I always wanted to do. And I thought I would have this long career in newspapers. I always loved history and politics. I remember the Watergate hearings as a small child. So I was constantly preparing to be in newspapers. I let the Batman dream die because I found I was bored by drawing all of those cityscapes and skyscrapers that he has to swing between. So I came out of college in 1990 and I got a job in Mansfield working for the News Journal, drawing political cartoons. But then I had an opportunity to work for a larger newspaper in Virginia. And that's where I spent 23 years and I raised 2 sons there. And I became a daily editorial cartoonist at the last moment that newspapers had any kind of power in our societal discussion. So by 1999, I could see that the internet was causing problems. And at that very moment, they gave me the opportunity to transition from drawing political daily cartoons to drawing history cartoons, like you see behind me on my virtual background, to help the kids learn in school. And because my oldest son was in 3rd grade that year, I took that opportunity to shift channels. So my joke to my fellow cartoonists is I'm still doing political cartoons, but they're about really old politics.
Thanks, Bentley. Gary and Laura.
I'll let him start.
Well, there's a certain similarity in terms of what Bentley has just spoken about, and that is, as a child, starting to draw because I saw my mother doodling. I too wanted to draw Batman, but something strange happened along the way, and I ended up drawing Harvey Pekar for 30 years, which is the most non-superhero character that you could possibly imagine. And I don't believe that Harvey ever swung from a skyscraper, but I could be wrong. He just didn't put that in any of his stories. His graphical comic, American Splendor, is really where I cut my teeth in terms of doing steady work. I really
Whoops.
div. And I guess what that says is I don't care that much about superheroes anymore. The kind of things that I've been doing with Laura also have been either historical, as Bentley said, a recent graphic novel, Fire on the Water, is a fiction based on fact about the bringing of fresh water to Cleveland in 1960. Fresh water here. The infrastructure from that is still here. Also, lately, we've been doing a comic book entitled Snark with a history professor from California, Bruce Olive Solheim, about a half human, half reptilian who is sent here to Earth to help conquer it and decides for some strange reason he likes us and what.
Gary and Laura, if you can hear us, you're cutting out.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can come back to Laura and Gary. Michael, you want to talk a little bit about your background?
Sure. Hi, my name is Mike Sangiacomo, even though it has my wife's name up on the screen. This is her setup. I was a reporter at the Plain Dealer for 30 years until my retirement last year. And it's funny, I remember when Reid contacted me about this, was it about 30 years ago or something?
Yeah, it seems like
it was, and this seemed so, I said, oh God, that's so far along, I'm not even going to worry about it. Here we are. Anyway, when I started at the Plain Dealer, after about a year or two, I was able to convince my editor that comic books were important. And I started a nationally syndicated comic book review column, news and interviews, things like that. 1993, I believe it started. And it ran geez, for up until almost the time, well, up until the time I retired. So it was kind of fun. These days with the internet going crazy, I mean, you can find a million of those kinds of columns. But back in that day, I mean, it was us and the Comics Journal and maybe a few other newspapers. Somewhere along the way, I got the idea that I could write. Actually, it was the president of Marvel who convinced me to do a book for Marvel, which never panned out because he was fired before the book came out. But using the old adage of write what you know, I said, I'm going to do a comic book about a newspaper reporter like me who can turn invisible, because all newspaper reporters think we're invisible. I mean, we go into a place and I've done this so many times at the Plain Dealer where there could be an active shooter, but I never really think I could get shot because I'm not really there. I'm just an observer. So my character, Jack, was that kind of a guy, except he literally could turn invisible. That was followed up by Tales of the Starlight Drive-In, which was my award-winning book, a series of different stories about a drive-in theater using the same characters over a 50-year period. And that's still my baby. I love that book, and it's completely sold out, and I have like 5 copies left, so it kind of drives me crazy. That's it. These days I'm freelancing. I'm writing for magazines all over the country, and it's been a blast. I mean, retirement is actually a lot of fun. It's pretty much me.
I'm sorry. Thanks, Mike. Let's head back to Laura now, since she didn't have a chance to talk when things cut out.
I'm sorry. Yeah, we keep getting a unstable connection here. I guess that's the nature of the beast, huh? Well, he was just about ready to say that about 4 years ago, we did start working together. No, not 4 years ago. In 2014, we started working together on paintings. And I always and it's asking my dad to draw me Snow White, and he would draw things. He was sort of artistic, but then I just continue doing it, and my strength is in color. Is the sound still okay?
Yeah.
Okay. My strength is in color. Gary's strength is in black and white, and so not only is it a perfect marriage most of the time, it is a perfect marriage with our art, because anytime and anything that he draws, if it needs color, it always comes to my desk. And before, when he was working with Harvey, I would do color if he needed something. But basically, I was doing my paintings. I was doing small shows. I was pretty much just doing and living the life of an artist. And then I was lucky enough to become a graphic designer, which kind of, I could keep my skill going, but I also could pay the bills. So that was really great. From 1986 on to 2010, I finally retired and said, heck with it, I'm going to just be a full-time painter. And so that's what I do now. And this year, I kind of have slowed a little bit down with the painting, and I did my artistic itch out in the garden. And, the garden now is kind of going out, but it was really beautiful this summer. So that was kind of fun to do. Now, as he said, we're working on Snark, everything, and it's a 60-page comic book. So everything that he draws, I color, and then I just put it all together, which is the graphic arts part of my training. And hopefully it will be really good. That's about it. So not only, we are opposites, total opposites. So we kind of make up one whole person.
Sounds good. I'm gonna vary a little bit the first few questions we had, because you've already answered some of the things that I wanted to touch on there. But I do have a question. When you were younger and were first becoming interested in cartoons, did you ever start generating your own characters and stories, or was it all a matter of sort of copying the well-known existent comics and characters?
It's only lately that I've begun writing more. Back then, it was more a case of doing what's, spot illustrations or trying to come up with compositions that told a story, if you will. But I really hadn't been writing much until the last few years. I've begun doing more, though, short stories rather than comic stuff.
I never got into comics until I met him. And, I've done some little things, but it basically has been the canvas and the paint for me. Now doing the comic book and the snark and working a little on American Splendor was my introduction to it. And I love it. I love any kind of can kind of get the words and the art and the color and everything out into the world. So
just remember, like Harvey used to say, with words and pictures, you can do anything.
yeah.
Okay. Oh, Michael's talking.
Can't hear him.
Tirzah, Michael's muted.
There we go. This
There we
feels
go.
like a presidential debate here.
There you go.
I pitched a million story proposals to DC and Marvel over the years, and I just didn't quite make it. But it's a shame. I'd love to write for either of the big two. I want to write my favorite character that I always wanted to write, believe it or not, is Henry Pym, Ant-Man / Giant Man for Marvel. He's the most underrated character they have. And he's also at this point dead, but I'm sure that's going to change.
In comics, it can.
Yeah.
I started by just copying Peanuts line for line for line, and I sent some of those to Charles Schultz and got back some very nice form letters that I still have. But of course, the advice was work on your own stuff. And so even in elementary school, I was doing my own stories. Now they weren't great, I had superheroes like, so I was growing up in South Dakota. I had a character named Snow Human, who was made of, wait for it, snow. So by the time I finished doing that for about 10 years and I'm graduating from high school, I had started to do the political stuff for the school newspaper. And, the challenge of life for me, what I taught my sons is you have to know yourself first and know what your strengths and your weaknesses are. And for me, writing fiction was not a strength. I tried it both in chapter book format, in comic book format, and it didn't sing. So I actually became a reporter coming out of college, and I gravitated to cartoons, much more in my wheelhouse to interpret a real life person than to create Snow Human.
Okay, as a follow-up question and a simpler one in some ways, for anyone else who's in our audience who might see this later, some of you have gotten training, if you will, sort of on your own and by talking with other individuals. Did you get formal training in terms of visual art related to graphics or illustration? I know Chris Colbert has a degree from Columbus College of Art and Design in illustration, but did any of the rest of you pursue that sort of direction, or did it sort of come from other ways? Gary and Laura, maybe you can start.
I'm primarily self-taught, except I did graduate from community college. I had two great teachers there, David Haberman and Gerald Kramer, but neither of them were interested in the comic stuff that I was doing at that point. As a matter of fact, Mr. Haberman said to me, "Why are you wasting your time doing that stuff?" And my only rejoinder was, "Because I love it. Isn't that why you do art?"
Well, and it is. But and when I was in second grade, my second grade teacher told my mother that I had the gift of color. Now, whether that made any difference to me, but it sounded like, oh, I have a gift. You know, I have a gift of color. So I remember my mom being happy about that. Now, when I was the firstborn also. So by the time I got to high school, I was lucky enough to be at that moment in my life at a time when West Tech had a specialized art class, and they were trying this out. Now, what this was all the grades in high school that were taking art were together. We had first period was art history, second, third, and fourth period was art. Then we went to lunch. Then we had letter and design. And then I only had 2 other classes that I had my entire high school. So I look at that as that sort of is a college education there in art. But since I was the firstborn, there wasn't the money that, you know, they could send me to college. They didn't think art was all that important. So that was another thing. And my scholastic grades weren't good enough to get a scholarship. So I'm self-taught, and I like being self-taught because you just afford any kind of interest. And so things change. You know, you start out as one thing and it, you know, goes into another thing. So I've just been very lucky to have an interesting way of doing my art. So,
Bentley, how about you? It sounds like you were sort of already developed as a graphic artist, even in high school, huh?
Oh, yes. I can't remember a time when I wasn't drawing. And I think, you know, drawing is one of the most democratic art forms. My mom was a piano player. She's a classical pianist, but, you know, you got to have a lot of money to get a piano. But for all of us, you know, for a young person, it's just a piece of paper. So there's a reason why drawing is probably the oldest art form other than singing, right? There was art before there was science in human civilization. And so I was on my stomach watching TV, drawing my own newspapers at age 8. So I was fortunate that I grew up in a very liberal arts household where art was valued. I have the same story to tell as Natalie Cole told. You know, she never sang with her dad, Nat King Cole, which shocked me when I first heard her say it. There's like one photo of them both sitting at the piano. And I never had that with my dad. He was a visual artist, but I think we had one session where he helped me draw, you know, Batman's foot. he showed me how to draw a foot. Great. But I've never had any training other than what I got in the K through 12 schools. Time I came out of high school, my idea, very liberal arts idea, was I wanted to get practice thinking, and I would take care of the drawing practice on my own. So I went to college and I majored in history. I never took a college class, and I think the world has borne out how important that liberal arts training is, because if you go now to a place like Columbus and get a very technical piece of software training, guess what? In 5 years, the software is going to be different. So I was really, I feel, the last generation to have to figure this out on our own. There has been a renaissance in the art schools. I love that you can now major in graphic novels and comic books. I do think that's fantastic. But I would just, you know, my warning to the young people is you're going to have to keep learning because the technology just keeps changing. And there's no substitute for just practicing your hand and your eye on a surface. I don't care if the surface is digital or paper or a wall or the sidewalk with chalk. You've just got to keep drawing.
And Michael, since you're a writer as opposed to a visual artist per se, anyway, would you say that your training, well, first of all, what kind of background do you have that you felt led you to writing for a newspaper? Do you have formal journalism classes, or were you just
Sure.
an English major, or what?
I was kind of just like a ne'er-do-well, really, in high school. And my local newspaper in King of Prussia, PA, put in an ad looking for an obituary writer. And I said, that's cool, I could do that. And that was back in '72. And, within months, I was learning, teaching myself to be a journalist. And then I went to Temple University and started taking journalism courses. But it was ironic because by the time I got my degree, I was working full time at a newspaper. And as far as the crossing over with comic books go, it's such a relief after years and years of strictly adhering to reality and double checking all the facts, despite what Trump and those other people say. We do triple check everything a million times. The freedom to write a story and to create incidents and to create characters out of thin air. And it was such a joy to me to actually do that. And it was very freeing. And the more I did it, the better I got at it. So yeah, no formal training, just a lot of reading and a lot of listening, and a lot of talking to other artists and writers because of my journalism career.
All right, moving on to a little bit heavier question here. What for you is the power or importance of comics or graphic novels or graphic images? All of those sorts of things. Bentley, you want to start out on that one?
So when I started doing my history comics, 97, 98, 99, it was still the traditional view of comics. It was very lowbrow. I didn't see it that way. But I was at the very beginning of this renaissance that we've had over the last 20 years, where it's become an art form that's worthy of being in a gallery, that's worthy of sitting in a school library. And, when I started, I had plenty of parents and librarians say, well, that's not real reading, right? We want the kids to read Harry Potter. But reading a comic book is just as good as reading a magazine article if you're a grown-up. It's just as good as reading a website page if you're a grown-up. All reading is good reading. And I actually have now gotten many teachers to understand that reading the sequence of the panels, 1, 2, 3, helps a lot of kids sequence thought. It actually helps many, many students to build their critical thinking skills. So I've done many teacher in-services, and I've spoken in many schools as an author to help the kids sequence ideas, both matching the words in the pictures, next and last. Great way to teach thinking, and it's fun.
Gary, Laura, how about you? What do you see as the power or the importance of graphics and graphic novels and comics and so on?
Are you asking me, Reid?
Yes, yes.
We kind of lost you again and it came back, so we missed the question.
I think that
I think he has it.
I think that in terms of the value of comics and graphic novels, one thing that to me is a kind of a overwhelming aspect of importance that most people don't seem to either understand or vocalize until it's brought up. And that is when you combine reading, the use of the left brain, with the observation of drawn materials, artwork, which is a right brain function, you have created a mnemonic device, something that helps immensely with remembering what you've seen, that I believe is a synergy that is more powerful than either reading by itself. Now, I'm not saying every comic is as good as a Da Vinci painting. I don't mean that, but I mean there's the possibility with the combining of these two things together of having something that sticks both in the head and in the heart.
Okay, thanks. Michael, how about you? Anything to add?
Sure.
Well,
My brother was the first person who taught me how to read using comic books. I mean, I started reading comics, I don't know, when I was 4 or 5. I can't remember a time in my life that I wasn't reading comic books. He would read the comics to me, and that's how I learned to read. And as a result, by the 2nd grade, I was reading at a 12th grade level, which kind of shocked my nuns who used to beat me incessantly. But so comics taught me a lot. And I think that's very important. And there's also a lot of freedom in comics. You can do things and say things in comics that you couldn't do in real life. And again, in my case, things I could never say or do as a reporter, I could get across in comic books. So I think they're very important. For about 8 or 10 years, I taught a comic history course at Case Western Reserve University. And it was such a popular course that it would literally fill up within minutes. As soon as I opened it up, boom, it would be filled. So there was a lot of interest in it. And, we had a great time just dissecting comic books over the years and looking at it and seeing what we could get from it. So I think it's very important. And people who never read comics don't understand that. Those who only go to the movies and think that the Superman movies are what's important. It's like, no, you got to read the comics. That's where it all came from.
okay. That sort of leads into another question. I can remember when I was a kid, I can remember in the drugstore, there would be several wire racks, the round racks with comic books in them. And so that was how you got them. You would go to the drugstore and you would buy them that way. At least that's the way I would. And then as we move along a decade or two, you have the underground comics in the 60s and the 70s. And then you have graphic novels beginning to appear, and sort of the ways you can begin to acquire them changed a bit. And you had some stores that were maybe game stores that also had comics or graphic novels. Now with the internet and now with all the digital forms that are there, including digital books, if you will, where do comics fit in this? Do they have a future? Will there still be a market for printed items? Will they all be visual in a digital way and not something you can carry around in a physical form? What are your thoughts there? Michael, yeah, go ahead. Oops.
There we go. I think comics are always going to be around in the physical form. There may be fewer, but I think that they will always be there because there's a need to be able to hold a comic in your hand. Same with a newspaper. I like to hold the newspaper in my hand and read it. That being said, there's also always going to be from now on digital comics. I mean, it's a huge thing. And unfortunately, it's also a thing that's abused. I was at a comic convention in Philadelphia years ago, and a guy was selling DVDs of comic book collections. And I'm looking at this, and I see mine in there. And I said, "Dude, you've like got my entire career on this DVD." And he just kind of walked away. So I mean, it's kind of sad that obviously I got nothing out of that, but you see that all the time, that people are just taking comic books, and I don't know how they do it. Magically, they can transform it into a digital comic. I guess they have to, I don't know, scan it, I suppose. But there's a lot of that going on. But there's also the comic book companies are also getting in on the act. So it's being done legitimately. And I think it's a proper art form. I'm not a big fan of reading comics on the computer, but there's a whole generation of people who think that that's the way it should be done. So I guess we've just got to learn to adapt.
Bentley, add to that?
Yes, so the audience will always want to read comics, the words, the pictures, the color, the action. Just like we've been drawing since the cave walls, we shouldn't get confused with the channel versus the actual art form. So the art form will survive, will go forward, even if it's digital, it's still comics, the mix of words and pictures. But as we just heard from Michael, you know, the problem is how do you pay the creators? And it's true that on the digital format, it's really hard to make anywhere near the kind of money that you made when the channel was completely print. Now I'm poised right between those two as we speak. I have 30 of my historical comic books in print. They sell on Amazon. I sell them to homeschoolers. I sell them in museum gift shops when those are open. But I've also started to transition. You can buy a bunch of my titles for your iPad. I have a smartphone app that you can use on your Android or your iPhone. But the amount of money that I make from the iPad and the iPhone sales is this. It's pennies compared to what I can still make in the profit margin on print. So for now, I'm in both places. It's the same story. It's the same mix of words and pictures. I'm still making comics, but how do I make a living at it? That's what's facing all of the creators, and that's a real problem. Because the internet, you know, we didn't figure it out fast enough. It's what killed newspapers as a channel. The idea that we've got a whole generation of people now who think you can get content for free. And that hurts people like us on this panel.
Anything to add, Gary and Laura, on that?
The only thing that I can think of is a lot of, with the graphic novels now, a lot of libraries have been telling us and other people that this is the one thing that young boys and girls want to read. So they actually, like all of you that have grown up with comics, you know, this is what they want to read. And with the graphic novels, they're getting bigger stories and maybe more historical stories and not just the superhero stuff. So I think that that's really a good thing that the libraries are embracing them, you know, and
Allow me to be dystopian for just a moment. Say, on the take is one big ass electromagnetic pulse and digital disappears.
I always ask people with art if that do digital art, if, you know, we had no electricity, would your art even exist?
Right.
And they look at me like, well, yeah, it would. Well, where? You know?
Right.
So I still like that.
On the cloud.
I still love that painting and you love the books.
You know, I think it's true too that for artists in general, whether you're a graphic artist, a graphic novelist, a comics artist or whatever, it's a hard living to make a living off of it.
Yes.
So in many instances, people who are doing that and are well known for it have side jobs too, just because they can't completely support themselves with that artwork. And one thing I was curious about too is for the physical objects, the fact that COVID has interfered with commerce as we know it, that is physical stores where people go into them. There may be some fallout from that as well in terms of the sorts of places that might have been selling the physical books as opposed to, you know, digital access to them. Amazon becomes the only option then in terms of trying to look for something and seeing if it's there on Amazon to buy it. I have another question that's related to this. You creators, how much of it are you doing now like when you send your work to be printed, how much is digital and how much is, to use the word analog, even though that's not quite true, but how much of your process now is involved with digital work?
Well, his is all pen and ink, but mine is all digital. And not the paintings, but mine is all coloring the comics is all digital.
But the outlets, both for the graphic novel Flare on the Water and the comic book Snark, both of those exist both as physical objects, and they are also offered digitally, whether from the publisher and or on Amazon or on Comixology.
I think he was talking though basically, or were you talking basically about
the
creating
work itself? When you create the work, how much of it is pencil on paper, and how much of it is
Now,
at some point digital?
The paintings are all, they're just one piece. But yeah, I always do the digital coloring on the computer. So not that I couldn't do it the other way, but yeah, we just scan that into the computer, and then it goes digitally to the printer.
Bentley, what about your comics now in terms of the creation of them?
So coming out of college in 1990, I could already see what was coming. I could tell I was either going to be among the first artists to work 100% digitally, or I was going to be one of the last drawing on paper. And I'm going to be one of the last drawing on paper, I think. I just like the feel of it. And for me, if you look at the building behind me, I'm still drawing on paper because I like the feel of the ink and the way I can rough it and make it look more historical. I can still see a very big difference between art that's created completely digitally, like on an iPad, versus stuff that's put on paper and then scanned and then colored. So as you just heard, I mean, I'm sort of that team. Instead of two people, it's just one. I draw it on paper, I scan it in, and then I use Photoshop to color my stuff digitally. And that works pretty well for me. I have my hand lettering is built into a font on my computer.
That's what we do too.
That too. So there's no doubt that the computers have been a boon to creativity. And I do have friends of my generation who have figured out the digital stuff, and it allows them to work so much faster. This sort of gets back to your last question, Reid. One of the ways that artists are trying to make money is directly from people, right? Eliminate the middleman. And I have friends of my age who are on Patreon, who have the day job for healthcare, right? And some of these are Pulitzer Prize winning cartoonists, right? One of them is actually an Ohio State grad, good friend of mine, Nick Anderson. You've probably seen his stuff on Facebook because he's really good at promoting himself, and his stuff is really good. He's the Pulitzer winner, but he's doing everything digitally, and that allows him to come out with a political cartoon sometimes twice a day. He's working so fast because the digital allows you to speed up.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a question from the chat box here, and I'll ask you. It sort of gets back to some of the earlier comments, but I'll open this up and ask for comments from you. Many of you speak of cartoons, yet your work seems to be neither animated cartoons nor cartoons in the sense of preparatory drawings. So what for you are cartoons in quotes, and what's the difference between what you do and either of those other uses of the term?
For me, cartoons are Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck. That's it. That's a cartoon. And a comic book is a comic book. So very big.
Cartoons in the sense of, if I do a preparatory drawing so that Laura can begin painting, I agree with you, Mike. Cartoons are funny stuff with animals beating the crap out of each other generally.
Well, and plus too, once you do the drawing for the paintings, we look at those as large editorial cartoons. They're pretty much in that vein because we tackle subjects like the environment and social issues and things that are a bit more serious, but done very pop art, surrealistic, so they look kind of
Oops.
Lost them again.
All right. Yes. Lost
Oh,
Gary.
I'm sorry.
Oh, there you go.
Lost you a little bit at the
Oh,
end
we
there.
lost
so.
him, huh?
Bentley, did you want to add something or?
Yeah, well, I love this art form because it's so malleable, because it's so broad, that it leads to this discussion that could really go on for days. We won't, but out in the general populace, cartoons don't just mean Bugs Bunny, they also mean what they see in the New Yorker. Now, that's not a sequential story, right? A gag cartoon is what we would call that. So then how do you describe like what I do? It's not a graphic novel, although I tell sequential stories, but I don't do novels because my stuff is nonfiction. So is my stuff a cartoon? That's why I've come to really focus on the word that the underground artists started in the 60s and the 70s, comics. That's literally the name of my business, is COMIX, because it's a mix of words and pictures told in sequence. And for anybody who hasn't come near it, this has been assigned now for almost 30 years in college classes, but I highly recommend Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. And when I gave it to my dad, who was an art professor of painting, photography, sculpture, he thought it was a great art history book. And when I gave it to my cartoonist friends, they thought it was a great comic book. And when I gave that same book to my brother-in-law, who worked for CompuServe, he thought it was a great book about information technology.
Wow.
That's how broad our art form is.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, I think some of the questions I had also had to do with what do you think there is for a future for this, but we pretty much answered that. I think all of you are at least semi-hopeful that some form of this will continue. And from the editorial side, depending on who we elect to office, there are either more or less opportunities there in terms of cartoons from the editorial standpoint. But do any of you have additional comments you want to make? Cover something we haven't talked about yet, or any other statements generally about the show or your ideas?
I wanted to say something, and Tirzah and I talked about this before we went on. I could never afford to be an original art collector because it was just too expensive. But somehow, over the years, I accidentally picked up a pretty decent sized collection of original art. The one I'm most proud of at this point is one by a guy named Leo Nowalk. And there it is.
Yeah.
Leo was one of the original Superman artists from the 1940s. He might have even gotten involved in the late 30s. And I had the chance to meet him at his trailer in the desert of Northern California years and years ago. And he was just such a sweet man. And I got home, and a week later, I got this in the mail, this Superman pen and ink that he did for me. So I'm just very proud of that. And if you notice, it has the original Superman S on it, which is the way he drew it. He's since passed on, but he was a great guy. And so I guess if you're a comic book fan, eventually you're going to start buying art anyway, whether you want to or not, or whether you can afford it or not. So you'll see some of the stuff that I picked up over the years in the exhibit.
I just always.
Laura, if you can hear us, you're cutting out on us.
Sorry.
You can repeat what you said. You're coming in now.
I just said that when I buy any kind of art, or it's always something that I want to live with every day, So it sometimes is something I have to save my money, and sometimes it's something that's reasonable and supporting another artist.
Sure.
Well, and that is one good aspect of being a visual artist is oftentimes you have other visual artists as friends who are willing to trade you for work.
Yes.
So that you may not be able to afford buying a lot of stuff, but sometimes you can acquire things through trade as
A little
well.
trade, a little money.
Yeah.
Bentley, did you want to add something here?
Well, as a historian and as a parent, I always have the big picture in mind. And I'm very thankful that I have had this career, thankful that I've had it at the time in history when I've had it. Now, I never made it onto the Today Show, and my stuff is never going to be turned into a movie. I'm okay with that because I know that in my own little corner of this wonderful art form, I have been able to influence generations of elementary school students now. Some of them went on and became professors. They're working right now as professors in the humanities, and they credit reading my historical comics. And I love that we've reached a point where, you know, Ohio State has this wonderful cartoon library that anybody can go and visit. It's treated as an art form. We do have all of these great schools with majors. And when I go to CXC, right, the September annual convention down in Columbus, I walk into that dealer room and I just feel like I'm walking into Oz because it's full of young artists doing beautiful, colorful work. Now, I worry about them because I don't know how they're going to make a living because, you know, the mainstream channels have all disintegrated. But the good news is they're pursuing their love. They're creating really interesting work. I mean, at this point, none of us could watch all the movies on Netflix and none of us could read all the comics being created. It's just impossible. So I think our art form is very similar to music, right? For hundreds of years, each village, each town had its notable musician, and you could go to the tavern on a Saturday night and listen to them sing, and you would give them a little of your money, and they never became Frank Sinatra, but it was something that was important to human civilization. So the 20th century was when you could get these massive stars like Elvis and Frank Sinatra who could sing for everybody. But now we're coming down off of that and we're kind of returning to the 19th and the 18th and the 17th century where everybody has their own little kind of town artist and singer. And, you know, you can kind of eke by, but you can be happy and you can make the world more colorful.
Yeah.
If you can find your niche, then you've got it. You're living the dream.
And if you're happy doing what you're doing, you don't need the fancy cars or you don't sort of, you know, stuff. You don't need stuff because you have so much to do and so much to enjoy. At least we do, or I do.
Well, we've got some time left here. Are there any questions from our audience?
And you all can ask via your video. We can unmute you if you raise your hand in the chat, or you can just submit a question through the chat.
I would like to ask if the class is still going on at Case Western. Are you still doing that?
No, sadly, there was a bit of a financial crush a few years ago, about 2 years ago, and they stopped it, which kills me because I used to really enjoy it.
It's always the arts that gets thrown out, isn't
Yeah,
it?
sure. Yeah. Even though it was such a popular class, I
Yeah.
said, how can you lose this class? It's so popular.
Right.
No real answer.
Encounters.
Yeah.
Oh,
All right.
I would say to Kathleen Jackson that just do what you love. That's the only advice, and practice.
There's an old saying for any creative person, and of course, I think comics creators are that type. You have to learn how to make your living with your left leg and use the rest of yourself to do your creative stuff.
Oh,
It's funny. I remember
Right.
when I decided that the time came to end Phantom Jack. So I killed the character, and he had always been a flawed hero by design. He always had difficulty because he did some things he wasn't proud of. So I knew that eventually he was going to have to become the hero, and he was going to have to die. And I came into the bedroom, and my wife said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "I had to kill Phantom Jack. He's dead." And she looked at me and she said, "You created him. You don't have to kill him if you don't want to." I said, no, he's got to die. Can't help it. It's time. And that's just the way it is. These characters become very real to you. They speak and they write themselves. I mean, you know it when you're reading a comic and by a new writer, and you say, Flash would never say that. No, that's not Flash talking. So they become real to all of us.
yeah. And I think you are right about comics sort of write themselves, because I know with the paintings, a lot of times I'm just the instrument. It just sort of happens and it just sort of evolves.
So the question they were addressing was in the chat for any of you that didn't see that. And the question was, what advice would you give to aspiring artists interested in comic art? Where should they start? How do they find their voice? And again, you can post questions in the chat, or you can just unmute your video feed and ask a question directly.
I'd like to tack on my answer if we don't have another question. And that is, all art is organic. So finding your voice, you have to use your voice, right? This is just a variation on what you've already heard. But it is, you've got to keep drawing. I draw differently now than I did 5 years ago because I've been drawing and it evolves. Same thing for a singer, same thing for anybody. You can look at the first Calvin and Hobbes versus 10 years in versus the very end, and you can see how it changes. You can see the change over Peanuts. It's an organic thing because it's the human hand and the human mind and the human eye. And so it's going to grow and evolve and to change. I think that's what makes it interesting. And that's what I always enjoyed about reading comics was you could have one character like Flash or Superman, but you could see it interpreted by different organic artists. So the only way you're going to find your voice is by using it.
And another thing I think you can, if you're really wanting to start comics, do small little books on your own and maybe hand them to your friends, or, just kind of say, or sell them for 50 cents each at school, or, just kind of get it out there. Let people know what you're doing.
And you can do that on the internet now.
Yeah, you can do it on the internet. But yeah, you can't just stay at that table by yourself. You have to get it out there.
That's the best part, is getting feedback from people about what you've done. It doesn't mean you have to take their advice, but it may do something to your thought process that, like you said, Bentley, it is organic. Yep. And it changes and grows.
Then it's just the evolution of the piece, and you don't do it by yourself.
Here's a related question to any and all of you. Other than participating in live events and comic cons, how do you promote and sell your work? Gary and Laura, you start out?
I didn't, let him take that.
I do Facebook mainly for promotion at this point.
Instagram.
And Instagram a little bit, which probably is ass backwards. It probably should be more Instagram than Facebook, but I'm old.
The young punks all like the Instagram.
In any instance, does a publisher help? I mean, like with Fire on the Water, what is there a publisher that would be promoting it too, or not?
Well, they are promoting it, but the problem is without those in-person things, I'm sort of left not in the iCloud, but on a cloud somewhere, not knowing what's really going on. The only thing I know is sales to libraries is good.
Yeah, the COVID kind of did stop all of the promotion that they were going to do for the book. Yeah.
Bentley, I know you have your website, so I'm assuming some of it gets promoted on that.
Yeah, and also the social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, right? I have a Facebook page set up just for my business. But the problem is the noise. I mean, all of these artists have their own Instagram.
Yeah.
So, you know, I pay for ads on Facebook to promote when I add a story to one of my smartphone apps, and it just gets lost. You know, I mean, I'm going to keep making content, but it's now in the middle of an ocean of content. So the best thing for me is to really serve my existing customers.
We're about to lose the connection.
Word of mouth is what really helps me, right? If I have a parent who loves my books, I need them to recommend to other parents. I need the school librarian to tell her fellow school librarians. And it's just a constant battle because, you know, the old model, the gatekeeper model, the publisher model is gone. You know, I mean, I would have loved to have drawn for Marvel or DC or to get cartoons in the New Yorker. That was the gatekeeper model. If you could make it through those very narrow gates, then you could be famous. Mm-hmm. That's gone. Now we're all hustling on our own and it never ends.
Yeah, you're right.
I feel like a hamster.
Yes. Yes. So that actually gets us back to the earlier question. I mean, you'd better be doing something you love, because the worst thing in the world is to be a hamster for somebody else.
You got it. Amen.
That's why they call it the rat race.
Yeah, right. That's right.
All right. Is there any other questions from anybody else? Any other comments? Seems like we've got some claps. I see some claps in the people that have their videos live.
Participating here today.
On behalf of FAVA, thank you to all the artists.
We have one question here. I see there is one question.
There's another one. What's your favorite comic you've ever worked on?
Well, that has to be American Splendor.
It's a tie. I love American Splendor for what Harvey was doing, not quite in a totally groundbreaking way, but that year after year, he continued doggedly pursuing his dream, and I respected that he was being as truthful as he could. If he did something good, it was in American Splendor. If he acted like an asshole, it was in American Splendor. So I respected him both as a person and as a creator. Now, there's a balance with Fire on the Water. I really love what Scott McGregor as an author was doing, trying to bring attention to a little known aspect of Cleveland and Ohio history. So, you know, Harvey's gone. I'm sorry he's gone. I love him still, but so is Scott. So we're doing more stuff.
And he is a great collaborator, so anyway.
And one more.
I don't have a favorite. No, go ahead.
One more question. How long does it typically take you to finish a comic book?
How many pages?
That's not in the question. 130, it says.
Oh.
That's more like a graphic novel, I think.
It took Gary to do a 300-page comic book. I mean, the graphic novel. It took 4 years.
With a little break for cancer.
So yeah, that took 4 years, and there was no color in that one. So it would take pretty much, that would have taken 6 years if we would have done it that way. But now the 60-page comic, when did you start that?
March.
So it's going to be for a 60-page comic for color and black and white, it will be about a year. But we're slow and we're old. So ask the other two.
Bentley?
Yeah, Bentley,
I
what
can
about you?
answer the previous. I can answer the previous two questions. The favorite book in my career so far has been a biography of George Washington that the Mount Vernon Estates in Virginia asked me to do. So that was quite an intimate of the work that I had already been doing. Have these, the keepers of the flame of the father of the country, to come to me and say, we want you to do a graphic biography. And it met all of the approval of their archivists. It was read by their whole team of experts, and it built off of some kind of CSI stuff that they were doing. They remade their museum about 14 years ago with 3 new statues of Washington that were much more lifelike than our previous depictions of him. And I took that and then put it into, the comic book format, which makes them even livelier still. And that took me about 4 months to go from blank page to finished book. But that was also, me doing all the writing, the drawing, the coloring. I'm a one-man shop. So about 24 pages in 4 months.
All right. Yeah.
Mike, did you have a favorite comic?
Tales of the Starlight Drive-In, which is available through Amazon, even though you got to get it from somebody else who already bought it. But when I didn't know any better, I thought I could do this, and it actually worked out. Had I realized what I was doing, I probably would have never done it. But I teamed up with 27 artists from around the world and wrote all these different stories and then parceled them out to people and got them back 1 page at a time. Looking back now, I don't know how I did all that, put it together, but and dealing with artists. Artists are nuts. I mean, no offense to your artists, but most of you guys are crazy. I had an artist who did the whole thing, did a whole beautiful 20-page story, and then say, you can't use it. I hate it. It's terrible. And I said, dude, it's beautiful. You did a great job. And he, no. And I couldn't use it. And I could never convince this guy that it was beautiful work. So yeah, artists are difficult to deal with, but we got it done. And it's still my favorite work.
Well, I think like a lot of artists in other forms, say theater, which I did a little bit of in school, we're often our worst critic.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
But I used to be married, and my ex learned to stay away from me the closer I got to the finishing, because the closer I would get, the more frustrated I was that it wasn't matching what was in my head.
Sure.
And so, what was great about starting off in newspapers was it teaches you to hit that deadline, even if you're mad, even if you think you're turning in crap, you turn it in. And what happens is I turn it in, I'm mad, it's a piece of junk, I can't wait to get rid of it. And then you come back 6 months later and you go, oh, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions?
I just have one more thing to say. I think with all the people that are on the panel, I think we're all lucky because we were doing our artwork at a time when things were changing. I got my first computer in 1986, but I graduated from school in 1968. So I did the old school way, which everybody seems to have done the old school way. Then it changed into being able to go into the newer stuff. So I think it's really beneficial to all of us to have gone through those different eras, so to speak.
Different tools.
Yes, different tools.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Reid, do you have any other questions or closing statements you'd like to make?
Did Reid hear you?
I don't know. Reid, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Oh, we have a new piece of art.
I thank you to everybody. I don't have any
Okay.
particular closing statements, but thanks to all the participants, thanks to our guests, and be sure if you haven't, or even if you have, go back and look at the exhibition online again. There's lots to see there, and you can spend a lot of time with it and enjoy yourselves and be moved by it. And do that.
Hey, I reposted the link that's directly to the exhibition page. So if anybody wants to look at that, you can also find other exhibitions, past exhibitions that we've had this year that were online, as well as any contact information. Thank you again to the artists. Thank you guys so much for participating. Thank you, Reid. Thank you, Reid. Yeah.
And thanks to Tirzah for the great job she did in terms of putting the online exhibition together.
Thank you. And thank you all of our guests for coming. Yeah. We've got some thank yous from some of the guests as well in the chats if you guys want to check those out.
We will.
Thanks a
All
lot.
right. And just a reminder, we will be posting this on our YouTube channel, which you can find if you Google. I should have a link to it on our website page as well. If you look under the social media links, there should be one to our YouTube page. But it's just under Firelands Association for the Visual Arts. And yeah, thank you guys so much. Can we give a round of applause for you guys?